Thank you. That's a kind introduction. And I think after hearing you, Professor Russell, that we could say that this is probably could have been called "And Now for Something Completely Different." And so, you saw the title. It's From Kindness to Killing. And this, we see this most dramatically in the media. And what we have to recognize is that the media overwhelmingly accept the positions that you have outlined in your contribution. That is the pro-euthanasia case. It's very much focused on an individual, it's very much focused on suffering, it's very much focused on rights and claims, and it's not concerned, and this is true of the Carter case, with the wider aspects of what that means, particularly for society and particularly for future societies. And here's an example. This is the front page of the Globe and Mail the morning after the Carter decision, and you can see what they've written across the photograph, which is of the man's got his back to you and the woman's hugging him, and it says, "A step towards kindness." In other words, what has happened, and I'm using the word deliberately, the word killing, killing has been converted into an act of kindness. So how has this happened? Well, it happens because of the Carter case. And there's what the Carter case did, which I've just outlined to you. They focus on the individual. They've got a novel, unbelievably novel interpretation of the right to life. There's very strong application of this right to choose, which is the implementation of the right to individual autonomy, that I've got the right to decide what happens to me. In order to do that, I must be able to choose what I want. And as Professor Russell has already pointed out to you, in that first paragraph of the Supreme Court judgment, they end it, and you really know with the end of that first paragraph exactly what they're going to decide. They say the choice is cruel, so we're going to override that. You know, I teach in law and in medicine, but when I teach in law, my law students, I tell them they have to look to the emotions of a judge as well as the judge's logical reasoning. And there's a very famous English lord called Lord Denning, and I think he's now dead. This is quite a while ago, but every law student used to read Lord Denning's judgment because they were the epitome of the best of legal reasoning. And Lord Denning would start off a judgment. For example, in one of them, there was a little old lady whose grandmother had been born in this house, her mother had been born in the house, she was born in the house, and she was now 95, and her name was Mrs. Brown. And this developer had bought up all the land around Mrs. Brown's house, but they couldn't get on with the development because Mrs. Brown refused to sell. And they had to try and get rid of Mrs. Brown, and this case was in the House of Lords in England. And Lord Denning's first 3 words were, "Poor Mrs. Brown." And you knew right then at those first words what was going to happen. 50 pages of legal reasoning later, Mrs. Brown won, and the developer couldn't do what they wanted to do. Now, what was really amazing here is that you would have thought that the right to life would have been a strong argument against euthanasia or assisted suicide. But what the court held, it was what Professor Russell told you, was that if you thought you couldn't have assistance, then you would commit suicide earlier while you still could have assistance, and that meant that you lost that portion of your life that you would have waited if you knew you could have assistance, and that was an infringement of the right to life. Well, what that in fact does is it converts the right to life to a right to death or a right to assisted suicide. Because and so I think the original framers of the Charter of Rights would have been astonished to see that interpretation of the right to life. So the second argument, and this is where I most strongly disagree with Professor Russell, is what I call the no differences argument. And I believe that euthanasia and assisted suicide are not part of medical practice, that legalizing them is not just a small incremental step along a path that we've already taken that includes the rights to have treatment withdrawn or refusals of treatment. It is a radical seismic shift in both medical practice and our foundational societal values. In other words, I believe that euthanasia, and I'll just use that word to include assisted suicide, is different in kind, not just different in degree from withdrawal of treatment. Now, what Professor Russell said about the Supreme Court saying that there was a similarity, and I agree with this, between the consents and protections you need for withdrawal of treatment and the consents and protections you need for euthanasia. Yes, the Supreme Court did say that, and I believe that's correct, and I agree with you about that. But that doesn't mean that withdrawal of treatment and euthanasia are the same. It just simply means that the kinds of consent that you need is the same. And so the issue is, are they the same? And you say they are, and I say they're not. So that's really where our fundamental disagreement is. In fact, I believe that what we decide about euthanasia, history will look back on it as one of, at first I used to say, the greatest values decision of the first half of the 21st century. But there's something happened in April that I think it's now one of two of the most important decisions that we will make in the first half of the 21st century. The other one is editing of the human germline, and that's an enormous decision. So, and then there's the no difference from other medical treatment arguments. But other medical treatments, and this is what I tried to say in the question period, they don't recognize a right to die, or let alone a right to be killed. What they recognize is that you've got a right not to have somebody else doing something to you without your informed consent. And in the law we call that the right to inviolability. And also there's an argument that there's no difference between what is called terminal sedation, which is being legislated in the Quebec legislation. The Quebec legislation calls it continuous palliative sedation and puts in a provision that the patient must understand that it is irreversible. Well, of course it's not irreversible. In practice you could withdraw it and the person could wake up. But what the Quebec means by that is that that is what is called slow euthanasia. They're going to permanently sedate the person. They're going to withhold any artificial hydration and nutrition, and they're going to allow the patient to die. And that is euthanasia. That's a form of euthanasia. And on Wednesday morning, I was doing a panel with the main person in Quebec who's drafted the regulations and was responsible for the legislation. And what he said was that Quebec is, and I was really quite surprised by this, although I've been asking about it, that Quebec does not want assisted suicide. Quebec only wants euthanasia. And so, I mean, Quebec's always different. So, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen about that. But he said, this was Yves Robert, Jeff, yeah, and he said, no, this legislation is not meant to cover assisted suicide. So what the court also said was that the rights to liberty and security in the Charter mean you've got control over your own body, and therefore if you haven't got that control, including to have death inflicted, those rights are also breached, which is a very, very broad interpretation of those rights and one that hasn't been held before. And then there was also more or less a no difference argument around suicide and assisted suicide. And the court pointed out, well, suicide's not a crime, so why should assisting suicide be a crime? But the reason suicide is not a crime, if you look back at the Hansard documentation when suicide was decriminalised, which was somewhere at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, the reason it was decriminalised was to try to save life, because families and people were frightened to go to physicians because the fact that they were going to attempt suicide was a crime. And so they decriminalised it so people could feel safe to get medical advice and counselling. Whereas assisted suicide is a move towards taking life, not saving life. Okay, so then we've got this euphemizing euthanasia as medical treatment and medically assisted death. We know from the surveys that when you call what medically assisted death or physician assisted death, when you call them euthanasia or physician or assisted suicide, public support for them goes down. And it really goes down when you call them killing, because then that's what you're talking about. And and also we know from surveys that a very large percentage of the population, in one Environics survey that was done, and it was over just over 2,000 Canadians, 1,000 of them in Quebec, 40% of them did not understand that euthanasia, even when you use the word euthanasia, meant a lethal injection. And a lot of people thought, well, it just meant that the physician would give you pain management, would look after you, and most of them understand that you've got a right to refuse treatment. So again, there's a problem there. And as well, I mean, one of the things I think you have to think about is that medicine has sworn an oath not to participate in this for over 2,500 years. And physicians have never considered killing their patients a form of medical treatment. So why now are we trying to make it medical treatment? My own argument on this is that if society wants euthanasia, then I think we should set it up outside medicine, because I think the harm that it will do to medicine is enormous, and I don't think it can be controlled. And so we could put it any other time that society has wanted execution. For example, when we had capital punishment, they didn't have physicians doing it. And in the United States, when it was suggested, the juries were reluctant to agree to a capital punishment conviction because they'd seen what the electric chair did. So that's when the US introduced death by lethal injection for capital punishment. But the American Medical Association said any physician that participates in that will not be allowed to be in the American Medical Association. Despite that, some physicians in Texas volunteered to be executioners, but they've had a lot of botched executions, as you probably know, and I mean, it's really horrible. The other thing is, I don't think most people realize, it sounds okay, you know, we'll just give you a lethal injection, but I have with me actually the guidelines that have just come out for from the Quebec College of Physicians. So far they're only in French, but there's a whole section in this on how to kill your patient, and it's not at all simple. It's got 3 distinct steps. This is the part actually. It's got charts of how much drugs you give. And the first step is that you've got to make your patient unanxious. So you give what the guidelines call, in each case, lethal doses, first of all, of Valium or an anxiolytic. Then you put the patient in a deep coma using barbiturates. And then you give a neuromuscular paralysis drug, probably succinylcholine, and then they've got instructions if things go wrong that they call complications, what do you do about it? So this is not just, you know, a nice, friendly, warm, cuddly doctor walking in and giving you an injection. It's a whole medical procedure, and one of the things that we're going to have to think about because of that is, what are we going to teach our medical students? We've got these bright, bushy-eyed, you know, bushy-tailed, bright-eyed big ears up wanting to cure the world medical students, and we're going to say, okay, today's your lesson on how to kill your patient. And so I think we have to start thinking about those other things as well. It's valid to think about the pain and the fear and the suffering and the emotions of the person you're trying to help. And there's no doubt that the people who are pro-euthanasia, pro-assisted suicide, do believe that they're trying to help. But there's an old saying in human rights: nowhere are human rights more threatened than when we act purporting to do only good, because then what happens is we don't see the surrounding harms. And I very much fear that we're in a situation here where that's the case. As well as that, there's new research in psychology about how is it that we make a decision whether something is ethically right or ethically wrong. And what that psychology research in the experimental psychology is showing is that our emotions and our intuitions, particularly our moral intuitions, although they're not determinative of what is ethically right or wrong, they play a very important role in that. And there's a saying in ethics that we ignore our feelings at our ethical peril. But once we have those feelings, we still have to check them out with reason. Reason is a very necessary safeguard. I actually believe it's a secondary verification mechanism, and the new research is more or less backing that up, that that's how we do make ethical decisions. So one of the issues here, in this area in particular, is that words matter in eliciting our moral intuitions and our emotions. And so when we sugarcoat what we're doing, when we call it medical treatment, when we have physicians doing it, we coat all of those intuitions and emotions that might be warning us. And so I call that sanitizing euthanasia by associating it with medicine. And that's, again, we have research that shows what a white coat does. In one study, they were going to do a research project. It was non-beneficial for the people who are going to be in it. So the researchers went around and they explained to the patient, this has got absolutely nothing to do with you. It was not going to make you better or anything. It's just a research project, non-beneficial to you. After they did the research, they went back to see the patient wearing a white coat. And they asked the patients, what did you think about the research? And a very high percentage of the patients said, oh, I feel much better after I've participated in that. Now, one of the explanations for that is that people think doctors only do things that are good for them and that they need, and therefore that's the reaction that they have. I was lecturing in Australia to a group of about 600 doctors at the Australian Medical Association, and like today, I was using the word killing, and I said we can't have doctors killing their patients. And with that, one of the physicians in the audience, who happened to be a friend of mine, and he's a palliative care physician, and he's a pro-euthanasia supporter, which is unusual. But the figures show something around 90 to 92% of palliative care physicians are against euthanasia. Anyway, his name was Roger, and he jumped up in the audience and he screamed at me, Margot, would you stop using that word killing? Doctors are not killing their patients. I said, well, what are they doing? He said, well, they're doing VAE. And I said, well, what's VAE? And he said, voluntary active euthanasia. So we use an acronym which doesn't elicit any of those feelings. And later on in the lecture, I said more or less what I just said a moment ago, that, well, if society is going to have this, let's keep it out of medicine and let's get someone else to do it. And so the issue became, well, who would you get to do it? And there's been a suggestion in an article in the Journal of Biology, Medical Perspectives in Biology, who's been trained to understand the law properly and to strictly apply it? So the answer is lawyers. So we should have a specially trained group of lawyers who are going to do this. I have recently been suggesting perhaps it could be the 9 members of the Supreme Court, because if you're willing to authorize something, you should be willing to carry it out. And anyway, he jumped up, he leapt to his feet in the audience and said, "Margot, are you crazy? You'd have lawyers killing people?" So when it was lawyers, it was killing, but when it was physicians, it wasn't. So one of the techniques that's used to get rid of people like me is to label them as religious and then say that religious values have got no place in the public square and that opposition to euthanasia is simply a religious value. I dispute that, and I don't think that that's an acceptable argument against it. There's also an appeal to empathy and compassion. This is the argument that, well, because you love your dog and your dog is suffering, then you love your mother and your mother's suffering, so why don't you give her euthanasia? Well, the short answer you see there is that your mother's not a dog. But that actually brings us into another philosophical argument about one that's called human exceptionalism or human uniqueness, and whether or not there's any difference between the respect owed to humans as compared with the respect owed to animals. And much as I'm a total animal freak and supporter, I believe that there is a major difference between what it is ethically acceptable to do to animals, from which I would adamantly exclude inflicting suffering on them, and what we may do and should do with respect to humans. And I don't think that the two are the same. So, now this is another argument that was in the Supreme Court case, and one accepted by Justice Lynn Smith and one endorsed by the Supreme Court of Canada, and it came from Professor Larry Sumner, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto. And what he argued was this, what's called the no deprivation justification. He said if your life is so awful that you don't want to go on with it, then dying is not a bad thing and it's not a deprivation. In fact, it can be a benefit. So this death as a benefit argument, that nothing good is lost by your life being taken or you being helped to take your own life. And that is essentially a quality of life argument under a different perspective. In other words, it tells you that you've got a life not worth living. And one of the areas where this is a dangerous argument is in relation to people with disabilities, because the same condition in which people would be able to have access to euthanasia can be the same conditions in which they live their lives, sometimes right from the very beginning, if these are congenital disabilities that they've got. And so Professor Catherine Frazee, who's on the committee that has been going to advise the government, but as of yesterday will no longer be doing so, they will just give the result of what they found as facts in their mission to go across Canada. She is a person with extreme disabilities, and she's been like that since birth. And so she's one of the people who talks about what does this mean, what message are we giving about the lives of people with disabilities. The next thing is this that we all agree on most issues approach. Now, in that book that was mentioned to you, the Ethical Imagination, which was my Massey lectures, one of the strong themes of the book is that we should try to start our ethics conversations from where we agree, so that we have an experience of all belonging to the same moral community. Because then when we get to disagreeing, the disagreements can have a different tone if we can think, well, there were some things on which we agree. And one of the things that's been happening in the euthanasia debate is that we've tended to start off from saying we all agree that everybody must be offered fully adequate palliative care, although in Canada at the moment the statistics are appalling. Only between 16 and 30% of people who need palliative care actually have access to it. And also, I don't know, Dr. Blackmore will talk about this, but the Supreme Court did not require that people had to be offered palliative care prior to having euthanasia, that they might not even have an option. And I know that in the factum that the Canadian Medical Association gave to, put into the Supreme Court of Canada, they did not require that palliative care be available before euthanasia was an option. And that's the same for the Quebec Act as well, that the person doesn't have to be offered palliative care. If you are in severe pain, you want to die. There's no question about that. I can attest to that. And so therefore, in another context, we now have an international declaration called the Declaration of Montreal, which has established that for a healthcare professional to leave somebody in severe pain is a breach of fundamental human rights. And the World Health Organization has endorsed that declaration, and the World Medical Association, which has got 9 million physician members, has adopted a version of it. So the first thing we have to talk about is not leaving people in serious pain, because if you are, you definitely want to die. And so that, I think that's something that we really have to be careful about. But what I wanted to say here is that I think here, I think we should just accept that we all agree about palliative care. I also think that we've got moral obligations to do something about making it available. And I think we need to focus on the fact that we strongly disagree about whether euthanasia should be available or physician-assisted suicide, because that's really where we disagree, and that's where it's so important. Now, the latest book that I've written is about progressive, this book here that I've showed you. It's called Bird, not Birds, there's only one bird, on an ethics wire. That is about the clash between so-called progressive values and what one of the judges of the Supreme Court called those who oppose them the restrictive values. Well, I'm a restrictive or a traditionalist or a conservative more, but that doesn't mean we're against everything. I'm not anyway, certainly. In a way, I'm a mixed values person. I'm permissive on some things and negative on the others. But when you look at the characteristics of progressive values as a whole, what you can see is that the Supreme Court, the Carter case, is a paradigm example of the application of progressive values, that individual autonomy implemented through free choice takes priority over other values. Progressives, particularly when they're anxious or frightened, and this is true for all of us, when we're anxious or frightened, the way we deal with that is to try to get some control. And if you're frightened of death, for example, one way to feel that you've got some control of death is to think, well, I'll get death before it gets me. In other words, you can have euthanasia. And some of the social psychologists in their research are talking about what they call terror reduction mechanisms or terror management devices. Now, they don't mean terror as in terrorists. They mean terror as in intense fear. Another characteristic of the progressive values camp is that there's a rejection of authority, and so nobody else has got the right to tell you what to do. And for example, the rhetorical question, whose life is it anyway, or whose body is it anyway, is a questioning of traditional authority to tell you what you may or may not do with your own body. Often that also, I think it's probably linked to hostility to religion, where you see that. And then they talk, and this is expressed in the Quebec report on which the Quebec Act is based. There's an express rejection of sanctity of life as as being just a religious value. And I think that that's a pity that the Conservatives have used that term, because sanctity does sound quasi-religious. And I think we need to talk about respect for life. And with respect to the Supreme Court, I think I think they made a lot of very serious errors. But I think one of their serious errors was that they looked at whether it was necessary to ban euthanasia, or whether that would, and the value they took was, are there any exceptions to the preservation of life? And I don't think preservation of life is the right value against which to test that, because yes, there are exceptions to the preservation of life, and Professor Russell gave you the main one. For example, you can turn off the respirator if the patient doesn't want it, and so you're not doing everything possible to preserve that life. But that's not the value that should be tested against. The value is, does this affect respect for life? And respect for life has to operate at two levels in a society. There has to be respect for every individual life, and there has to be respect for human life in general at the societal level. And even if you could say this is a tolerable derogation from respect for the life of an individual, you still have to look at the overall effect of what it does to a society in general. Now, I've just got the figures for Belgium and the Netherlands about what percentage of people in those countries where euthanasia is legal, what percentage of them are dying from euthanasia. And the figures, which are probably, they're well underestimated, because we know that at least 23% of cases of euthanasia in the Netherlands are not reported. That's an article in The Lancet in 2010. And yet, even not counting all the ones that are not reported, just over 4% of all deaths are now by euthanasia. And if you look at the original figures, they were down under 1% when this started. So it's not true that this doesn't expand. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I'm extraordinarily worried about what we're doing to respect for life. And the other thing that we have to think about is not just respect for life in the present, but in the future, for future generations. How do you think your great-great-grandchildren will die if we implement this? And I think you'll find they'll die by euthanasia. This is a dangerous area, but I also think we have to ask, what can we learn from human history? John Ralston Saul calls it human memory, which I think is a wonderful term for it. What does human memory tell us? You know, First Nations people, I was on an ethics committee for where are we going to put the nuclear waste in Canada. And on that committee was George Erasmus, who used to be the head of First Nations. And when it got to his turn to say what he thought to begin with, he said, well, if you'd left it to us, we would never have had this problem, because we never would have allowed the nuclear waste to be created in the first place. And then he said, you know, what we do is we look back 7 generations and we look forward 7 generations, and we try to see what we can learn from looking back, human mystery, human history, and we try to imagine what will happen if we do this, human imagination. Both extraordinarily important human ways of knowing. And I think we've got to do that with euthanasia. And with respect, again, there was absolutely zero of that in either the Supreme Court of British Columbia or the Supreme Court of Canada. In fact, the Supreme Court of Canada really didn't do much work on this judgment. It literally took the judgment of Justice Lynn Smith and endorsed it, word for word mostly. Anyway, again in my book there's 50 pages doing a comparison of Lynn Smith and the Supreme Court and an analysis of it. And I described the Supreme Court, I had to say again with respect, because I'm a member of the Quebec Bar and I'm likely to get wiped out if I'm disrespectful to the Supreme Court. But I think the way you can phrase it is the Supreme Court hid behind the skirts of Justice Lynn Smith in endorsing this, and went ahead with it. Anyway, So we can say, why suddenly, after 2,500 years, do we think this is a good idea? And the reasons are not just that you've got a suffering person. We've always had individuals who got old, became fragile, were dying, had pain. We can do miles more now to help those people than we ever could in the past, except suddenly we think this is a good idea, we'll give them a lethal injection. So I think we have to really question ourselves about what has happened that we think this is the right way to go. And then this is what I've just been saying to you is we've got to look at this at different levels. In a secular society such as we are in Canada, we don't any longer use religion to carry the value of respect for life. The two main institutions that carry the value of respect for life for society in general are the law that says you must not kill intentionally, and medicine that has said up to now, we will not kill. And so we're going to change both of those institutions, which in our society are the main institutions that carry the value of respect for life. Just on that previous slide about human memory, you know, one has to be terribly careful citing the Nazis, because of course that was an extreme, a horrible, I mean, you can't find words to describe what happened there. However, again, when I was writing the book, what I came across was an article from the New York Times of October the 7th, 1933. And I agonized about whether to put it in the book or not, and finally I decided to do so. And the reason was, this was right at the beginning of the Nazi regime, well before the Holocaust, or 7 or so years before. And you could publish that article today and it would describe exactly the sort of things that we're hearing in Canada, and exactly the same sort of opposition to what we're seeing. And also the same questions about doctors are querying who will be eligible, what sort of regulation they're going to have. And then there's some other stuff that talks about how Hitler was encouraging the doctors to do this. I mean, really spine-chilling stuff. But I also saw another quote, which I will read to you, and this comes from a professor of philosophy, Hendrik van der Breggen, a Canadian, and he says physician-assisted suicide threatens to dangerously weaken a society's life-respecting foundations. And then he says, consider this observation from Leo Alexander, who was the medical advisor at the Nuremberg war crimes trial. Now, the Nuremberg war crimes trial, as you probably know, was a trial of the physicians involved in the Holocaust, who executed the people who were executed in that. And here's what this man said. He said, whatever proportions these Nazi crimes finally assumed, it became evident to all who investigated them that they had started from small beginnings. The beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitude of physicians. It started with the acceptance of the attitude that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in its early stages concerned itself merely with the severely and chronically sick. So, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen in Canada, but I don't think we can ignore that either. So, the other thing here is that euthanasia, I disagree with you about this, Professor Russell. And we've got powerful evidence of this, and this is one of the scandals of the Carter case. We've got very powerful evidence of the slippery, there are two kinds of slippery slopes. There's the practical slippery slope, that is the abuse of euthanasia, and there's the logical slippery slope, that is once you introduce it, you can't control the situations in which it will be used and the people to whom it will be applied. Now, it's true that Justice Lynn Smith found that there was no slippery slope, and as Professor Russell told you, the Supreme Court endorsed that. They did it basically on the grounds that appeal courts will not revisit facts unless those facts are shown to be so incredibly wrong that you can conclude that the people who found them must have been bribed. But the evidence was there, and Justice Smith rejected it. The sorts of slippery slopes that I'm talking about, that when euthanasia was first introduced in the Netherlands, it was limited to competent, consenting adults who were in serious pain and suffering. Notably, though, interestingly, they didn't have to be terminally ill. And it would, you know, again, there was this sanctimonious talk that it would only be rarely used. Now what we have, as I've mentioned to you, over 4% of all deaths are by euthanasia. It's not limited to competent consenting adults. It's being, I think it was 63 patients with Alzheimer's disease were euthanized in 2014. There's a new protocol called the Groningen Protocol, which allows people who have a baby with serious disabilities to have the baby euthanized after birth. There is this protocol for children aged 12 to 16. Over 16, they can actually consent for themselves. 12 to 16, they can have euthanasia with the parents' consent. There is euthanasia now for purely psychological suffering. If you are severely depressed and you want euthanasia, there have been actually quite a few cases of that, and quite a few cases of euthanasia for only psychological suffering. Belgium has gone one step further. It's got a committee. When I first heard this, I thought people were making it up. Belgium has got a committee that before you euthanize, you can go to this committee and get their permission for, as soon as you've been euthanized, they can take your organs and use the organs for transplantation. And I mean, that just sounds appalling, and you just wonder when the next step will be that they'll actually carry out euthanasia by removing the organs, and instead of by giving lethal injections. They'll anesthetize, but the reason for that would be that the organs would be in no danger of being affected by the drugs that are used for euthanasia. And that's a bit like the situation in China, which we've been trying to deal with, where people who are in prison, many of them for religious reasons, that they're members of the Falun Gong, when overseas transplant tourists come, they tissue type the person who needs the organ, and they tissue type the person that's in prison, and then they execute by a gunshot to the back of the head in order not to damage the organs that they want to take. Now, there's been a huge effort by the International Transplant Society to try to stop this, and China has passed some, I don't know whether it's laws or regulations, to say this is not going to go on anymore, and that they're not going to accept overseas tourists. But it is a major problem, and so those are the sorts of things that we have to think about. Where does this go? And are there slippery slopes? And we know in one study done by actually by a Canadian group of researchers in the Flanders area of Belgium, they surveyed about 6,000 doctors and asked them if they'd ever carried out euthanasia, and of the ones that had, they resurveyed them, and 32% of the ones who'd carried out euthanasia said yes, they had done it, not in accordance with the requirements of the law. 32%, a third of them, had been and when that was presented in the court, I can't remember if it was Justice Lynn Smith or the Supreme Court said, oh well, Canadian doctors are not like Belgian doctors. Canadian doctors are better behaved. It's also relevant that the evidence that Justice Smith accepted as showing that there was no abuse of euthanasia in those countries where it's legal, the exact same evidence, because the court actually said this. The High Court of Ireland said, there's been this judgment in Canada. We're going to look at the evidence that was presented to the judge, and we are going to see whether we think she was right in her conclusion. This is a very rare situation that you get this revision by another court, that there was no abuse. And they came to the conclusion that they thought that there was serious evidence of abuse, and therefore they would not allow. It was the same thing. It was a constitutional challenge, that it was unconstitutional to prohibit assisted suicide or euthanasia, and she said no, because we can see that the abuse cannot be avoided and that it expands. And it's natural that it would expand, because the reason is built into your permission is built in the ability to expand. Because if you start off by saying that you have to be competent and suffering, then people say, well, if you're just competent, isn't that enough? And if you look to the basis on which you allow this, which is the right to autonomy, then competence, and this is you exercising your autonomy, you should be allowed to do that. So in the Netherlands at the moment, they've got they're sort of acting outside the law, but under a rubric that says if you're over 70 and tired of life, you can have euthanasia. And in the latest Dutch report, I can't remember the exact number, but there's something like 14 cases recorded where the euthanasia was because the people were over 70 and tired of life. And so that's why and then the other thing that happens is, well, if you're not competent but you're suffering, isn't it discrimination to let competent people have it and not let people who are not competent? It's discrimination on the basis of mental handicap. And again, that's the reasoning that they use to approve it for Alzheimer's patients or people with other dementias who can't give their consent. So you necessarily see this expansion. I believe, and you raised this, Professor Russell, that we do need to get, I'm a bit tired of all the people who are anti-euthanasia saying, oh, we're not going to talk about whether it's inherently wrong, or they'll label us religious. I think we do have to get back to thinking about, is this inherently wrong? And not just for individuals, but also for societies. What's this going to mean for societies? And then what is happening on the other side is this idea that it's all moral relativism. You know, there's no right, or absolute right or wrong. It's just a matter of working out what your own preferences and the criteria for deciding are. And it's utilitarian. So I'm up to my conclusion, which I can hardly believe. I usually go way over time, but this is to summarize what I've been saying to you. Euthanasia is not just an incremental expansion of current ethically and legally accepted end-of-life decisions, such as refusal of life support treatment, as pro-euthanasia advocates argue. Acting with an intention to kill is different in kind from allowing a natural death. Euthanasia is not medical treatment. Defining it as such presents serious dangers to patients, the trust-based physician-patient relationship, medicine, law, and society. If euthanasia is legalized by society, we must take the medical cloak off it and have some specially trained persons other than physicians mandated to administer it. We need to ask ourselves, if euthanasia is permitted, how do we think our great-great-grandchildren will die? What kind of society will we have left to them? Will it be one in which no reasonable person would want to live? And in that respect, I'd refer you to P.D. James's book, The Children of Men, in which there's a stunning chapter on a future world in which euthanasia is compulsory, or actually suicide is compulsory at 80 years of age. It seems that most politicians and many people in Western democracies, such as Canada, do not recognize the momentousness of a decision to legalize euthanasia. It's not an incremental change, but a radical and massive shift in our societies and civilization's foundational values. A prominent Australian politician with whom I was argued for legalizing euthanasia and captured the trivialization of death that informs support for euthanasia in these words. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, when you're past your use by or best before date, you should be checked out as quickly, cheaply, and efficiently as possible. But we're not products to be checked out of the supermarket of life. And what would the cumulative effect of euthanasia on vulnerable people be? Consider, for instance, that Belgium is currently looking at legalizing euthanasia of people with Alzheimer's disease. And I was in a medical school class at McGill just a few weeks ago. Final year medicine, these young people had all passed their final exams. They were doing an ethics class and they were about to graduate. And I was arguing as I'm arguing to you today, and one of the students got up and he was really furious with me. He said, "Don't you understand? We can't afford not to have euthanasia. We have to have it so that we can save our healthcare system and reduce our healthcare costs." Now, even, I think you'd agree with me, Professor Russell, even 5 years ago, if I brought up anything like that, that we're going to use this to save costs, all the pro-euthanasia people would say, "Straw man, you're hysterical, you know, this will never happen." It is now in the literature. It is being discussed in the literature. So we have to face that. What would be the impact of euthanasia on the shared values that bond us as a society, and in setting what we call in ethics the ethical tone of our society? It's wisely said we can't judge the ethical tone of a society by how it treats its strongest, most privileged, most powerful members, but we judge it by how it treats its weakest, most vulnerable, and most in need citizens. Dying people belong in that latter group. I used to say that I cannot overemphasize how important it is for each of us individually and together to do all that we can to prevent euthanasia being legalized in Canada. But now, after the Supreme Court judgment in the Carter case, that's a forthcoming reality. Although politicians could prevent euthanasia being legal by using the Charter's notwithstanding clause to override the court's decision. But the chance of that happening is that of a snowball in hell, quite frankly. Assuming they don't do that, I believe we've got to get the narrowest and strictest legislation possible, so that although physicians killing their patients is a legal possibility, it does not become a general practical reality. I predict history will see each society's decision about euthanasia as a seismic shift in values, as a major turning point values decision of the 21st century. So I think we have to hold life in the palm of our collective human hand and think what we must not do if we are to maintain the required respect for that. Thank you.